Brilliant. So let's kick off here. Welcome everyone to our webinar focused on how to power up your best project with must-have contract clauses to protect your assets value. Very excited today that we have Andres, Managing Director at Blanboz, who is an expert on all things commercial engineering, technical risk relating to best projects, and at Blanboz have worked across over 20 gigawatt hours of best projects in recent years. And for anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Sarah, co-founder, CEO of Infyos. We are an automated platform that works with best developers to manage supply chain and ESG risk. So today we are going to be going over commercial and technical risks that face best projects and the key contract protections on that side, as well as ESG and regulation risks and key contract protections there. We will also make time for questions at the end, so feel free to drop any questions that you have into the chat box at the bottom. Either you can stay anonymous or you can include your name when you ask the question. Brilliant. With that, Andres, I will hand over to you to talk about commercial and technical risks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for your time and for joining us in this session. So, yeah, as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to get straight into the key technical kind of risk that we have gathered in our experience in drafting technical specifications and contract negotiations so far. Are you giving me control to?
Let me make sure you should have control. Oh, there you go. You should be able to control it now.
It works. Yes. Thank you. So yeah, starting with employer's requirement, you may call it employer's requirement, technical specifications, minimum functional specification, whatever the name is. You will hear often and a lot from me saying that this is probably one of the most important documents in your contract. Why? Well, I'll put you in three different scenarios or three questions. What do you think is going to protect you when there is dispute or claims during constructions? You will probably hear the answer that is, or know the answer that is going to be your technical specifications, especially when they are well detailed and structured. The second one is, how can you protect the margins of your revenues, of your incomes and the margins, by not increasing your capex and by having multiple variations during the construction of the project and whatnot? Again, that will be your employer's requirement and how well specified it is. And finally, how fast you want to go in your financing process. So the more well detailed technical specification you can have, the quicker it's going to be the due diligence with the lender's technical advisor. There is sometimes a misconception across our clients and projects that you shouldn't be prescriptive and detailed on your technical specifications because you're going to be assuming the design risk. Actually, there are many ways that you can avoid that scenario, but you definitely need to outline what you want of your project without having to take the design risk of when you're specifying the project. Equally, we should have a very precise and outline and defined division of responsibility or ratio metrics. In here, what we look is to have a definition of the responsibility of this key scope of your project, because we have identified that through the gaps is where you're going to have your major risk. These two documents should be treated separately, but at the same time, they should be aligning almost perfectly. And the two together is going to be your technical arm of your contract. So what we normally do is that we have a quadrant risk matrix that we like to use to identify those key risks and also concerns from our clients, where we classify them from low risk to higher risk, and then being able to mitigate them through wordings on the technical specification. So to give you an example here, these are the most common ones that are recurrent in all of our projects. And we today are going to focus in kind of the key ones that are not well understood. And as the technology matures, obviously, you're going to get new risks um, coming along. And that obviously, hopefully, you can mitigate through your technical specifications. One key one is the state of charge estimation errors. There are companies like Accure, Twice that have done good research on estimating what is the actual state of charge errors in operational batteries. And you will be surprised to hear that there can be errors as high as 30%. And obviously, this is a concern for any projects because this number is a key parameter that is going to be used for you to have availability of your plant and to have forecasts of your revenues and utilization of your batteries. So this is due because of the hysteresis effect that you have in batteries. To give you a very simplistic terms of what hysteresis effect is in batteries, imagine that you're climbing up a hill and you stop in a particular point. Your legs are going to feel a bit different compared to when you're coming down. So the same happens in batteries. When you're charging and discharging, the DC voltage in your battery cells are going to be slightly different. And the state of charge is not going to be showing you an accurate number if your model doesn't take into account hysteresis effect. The majority of the best suppliers, BMS, uses column counting, and the counting doesn't allow for hysteresis effect. And that's why we, in our technical specification, recommend specify the use of particle filter or extended Kalman filter or dual unscented Kalman filter, which is the preferable option. And obviously, this is going to have increase the complexity of the modeling and possibly the cost. But ultimately, it's all about what is your appetite for risk and what you want to, how you want to balance it. And the less risk you want your project to be, naturally, the higher the cost is going to be. So what we do is that we add the state of charge estimation errors guarantee as part of the performance guarantee suite. And in there, what we're trying to specify, what we're trying to negotiate with the contractor and specify is that there are SOC estimation errors guarantee in a yearly basis that the value, the state of charge estimation error goes from 0 to 2% at the years from year 0 to year 10, and from year 10 to the end of life is below 5%. And obviously, if there are underperformance, there are going to be associated delay performance guarantees, LDs. Moving to another very important point, sometimes is quite a complex one to agree with battery suppliers, is the performance test and temperature impact. As you may know, in the curves that you agree commercially, the main one is the state of health curve or the round trip efficiency. Both are going to be linked to ambient temperature. But in small letters in your warranty agreement, you're going to be seeing that these curves are subject to a standard test conditions, or in other words, 25 degrees ambient temperatures. Obviously, to achieve 25 degrees is almost, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's very challenging to get it, especially if you are in a warmer regions. And then there could be a loophole where your contractors can claim that they're not liable for underperformance, and therefore they're not subject to penalties. So to remove these uncertainties, what we use in our technical specification is that the supplier has to declare correction factors to adapt these test results to whatever the ambient temperature is during testing. By doing this, you're going to have a more dynamic state of health curve, and obviously, hopefully, it will also allow you to have flexibility during your warranties. Another important one is your thermal management and the local environmental adjustment. As you know, you have your UL 9548 test, and those tests relevant for the UL 9540 certifications. Those tests, again, are done on the lab conditions. So the way that we try to remove the risk or to trying to adapt this test to the local project condition of the project is by requesting the supplier that they should do a heat flux design and a CFD study, incorporating this value into this evaluation so you can validate the safety features of this test, and also whatever design inputs or assumptions that you took in terms of fire propagation and whatnot. But this, again, has to be requested in your technical specifications for them to be able to cost it and to provide it. Moving slightly on the more commercial side, we have the commissioning delays and associated LDs. Probably you are more used, so you will see in the majority of the projects that delays LDs are linked to taking over certificates. Actually, we have seen an increase or better management of the contractors program when we assign delays LDs to critical milestones of the project. And what we do is that we allow for a portion of that delays LD for this key milestone, and we have an overall cap for delays LD. Then we have the defect notification period and the state of health buy down under the battery supply agreement. We specify in our requirements and negotiations that the DMP for the best supply agreement is going to be 5 years instead of your conventional 2 years. By doing that, we can optimize a bit your OPEX, because what we're trying to include that cost into your CAPEX. The state of health buy down is, you will see some suppliers trying to push down in their negotiations to be linked to the TOC or taking over certificate. We actually strongly recommend against this at this stage, because you increase the risk profile of your project and the uncertainties as well. And I'm 100%, let's say 99% sure that your lender is not going to like this, and they're going to push onto this. What we recommend, if the buy down is an option to alleviate or to increase the protections of the LTSA LD caps, is that you have that buy down at the end of the DMP period. Poor OPEX performance. We always include a clause in our contract and our technical specifications that allow the employers to terminate the LTSA if they wish so, but to keep the equipment defect warranty. I strongly suggest that you look into this, because by doing this, you can find ways that you can optimize your OPEX, because there could be instances that you may use and approve contractors to do the O&M and then reduce the cost of your OPEX. But your contract or technical specification should have a clause that allows you to do this. And finally, poor definition of the test for completions. You would be surprised how many projects we have been involved that this hasn't been defined properly. What we suggest is that you need to have an independent schedule or an appendix of the ER detailing what are the tests and the pass-fail criteria to achieve taking over certificate. And more importantly, we strongly recommend to allow for rejection values, because if the worst were to happen, you have an exit contractually to not take the project. That's me, and thank you very much for your time. And now let's move on to Sarah, who's going to be taking you through the ESG regulations, risk, and how to protect your contract. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andres. And to take it over, I'm going to start by talking about why ESG risk has become such a priority in the last few years. And one of the big reasons we see is that ESG regulations have increased over 155% over the last decade. And so that's been a huge driving force of financing requirements for supplier ESG due diligence. Financing in the sense of when you get to asset sale or in the sense of debt and equity financing, often part of their due diligence is to due diligence how good your ESG due diligence has been. And so to break down some of these key regulations, you can see that they've started all the way back in the early 2000s with the waste electrical and electronic equipment regulation that's in the UK, but you have similar extended producer responsibility regulations across Europe. And those are focused on how do you handle the battery at end of life to ensure responsible recycling and circularity. Then coming in 2015 was the Modern Slavery Act, which the UK has kind of led the way on putting provisions in place around your responsibility to manage forced labor and other aspects of modern slavery. And right now, this proposal to amend this to create a 4% fine of annual turnover for non-compliance. Then starting in 2020s and onwards, you've seen what sometimes gets called this regulation tsunami, but effectively it's this wave of regulation we've seen in the last 5 years focused on ESG and supply chains. So in the US, you had the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that came into force in 2021, and last year did 1.7 billion USD worth of shipments getting reviewed or sanctioned, with solar being an initial target a couple of years ago, where many of the largest solar manufacturers got shut down from accessing the US overnight. And as of last year, BESS also, or batteries, got put into the high risk category. And whilst this is a US regulation, what we tend to see is that it sets a global standard for a lot of the financing and traceability requirements around BESS. And looking forward to 2027, there's a European equivalent regulation coming into effect. Then in 2021, we also had SFDR regulation, which is effectively an anti-greenwashing regulation applicable to financial institutions. And so a lot of the investors into BESS assets are under this regulation. And it means that depending on the category of green investment they want, they need to be able to report on that investment's positive impact, but also the potential negative impacts of their investment from an ESG point of view. Then you have CSRD that came into force in 2023, which is an ESG reporting regulation in Europe. And then in 2023, we also have this battery specific regulation, the EU battery regulation, that's come into force and has a staggered set of requirements coming into place over the next 10, 15 years, including things like the carbon footprint requirements, supply chain traceability, supply chain risk management, battery passport, and many other requirements. And then finally, we also in 2024 have seen the CS Triple D come into effect, which is a similar, in some ways, European ESG regulation. But importantly, it's not just about making sure that the companies are reporting their ESG practices, but in making sure that they have systems in place to manage ESG across the supply chain. And so depending exactly on where you operate, how you operate will depend on whether or not you're directly under these regulations, or whether you have suppliers that are under these regulations, or whether you might have financing institutions behind you that expect you to voluntarily align with these regulations. And then when it comes to why these regulations exist, the key that I'm sure most of us are aware about the battery supply chain is that it's one of the most complex supply chains out there, from raw material extraction through to raw material refining, cell component production, then the battery manufacturing, and then finally into the BESS integrator. There's multiple steps across the supply chain, and at each of those steps, you can have anything between 50 and 100 different suppliers. But importantly, from an ESG perspective, the challenge often is that about 80% of the BESS supply chain risk sits not at your BESS integrator level, but further up into the supply chain. And so when it comes to understanding, okay, what are the major ESG risks affecting my best project, my best supplier in a supply chain, general industry standard is to look at it from this matrix of understanding what is the likelihood of a specific ESG risk occurring. So looking at what is the specific activity, region exposure, any specific incidents that are occurring, what are the policies, processes, disclosures that would mean that risk could be occurring. And then looking at the severity. So that's how serious is this risk if it takes place? How widespread is this risk? And then also looking at how difficult is this risk to solve once it has happened? Can I put something in place that mitigates it? And so when it comes to ESG risks for BESS LFP, what we see is that the risks that across the industry tend to be the most high risk areas. One is forced labor and modern slavery. So according to our data at Infyos, about 75% of global battery production at some point in its supply chain has a connection to a forced labor incident. And so what you, if you're a developer, want to understand is, does the specific product I'm procuring from the specific supplier have a connection to that incident? That could mean either I'm breaking regulation or I don't meet financing requirements. And then secondly, the other high risk area that we see is energy and greenhouse gas emissions. So whilst obviously we all know batteries are an essential component to decarbonization, the manufacturing process and supply chain process of batteries, majority of that is still fossil fuel powered manufacturing, which means that there is a couple years at least of carbon payback period when the asset goes live until those emissions are balanced. And so what you see is a lot of the regulations, like the EU battery regulation, is mandating more disclosures around battery carbon footprint as a result. So then when it comes to negotiating contractual ESG clauses, we kind of break this down into three main areas of how to approach it with your supplier. So one is at that pre-contractual due diligence stage. So as part of supplier qualification, assessing the ESG performance as a condition of tendering, including assessing that supplier's performance on responsible sourcing, regulation compliance, and traceability. And so looking for any red flag risk identification. So independently verifying, does that supplier meet regulation compliance? Are there any major ESG incidents? What is the strength of their ESG management systems in managing any of the major risks? And then ongoing monitoring and mitigation measures. So agreeing with the supplier to monitor their ESG performance, monitor for any instant changes over time, and also for them to implement time-bound measures to address any red flag risks that you find. In terms of kind of key things to look out for here, one is that often the kind of initial approach, especially in kind of early days of developers, is to take quite a box ticking approach to asking suppliers, okay, do you meet these requirements, rather than taking a kind of real assessment of their ESG risks. And often what that ends up looking like is relying on self-assessment, where the suppliers themselves declare that yes, I comply with all these regulations. No, I don't have any incidents, without independent verification sitting alongside that, which now is what a lot of the financing and the regulation expects. And then when it comes to the contractual ESG clauses, you want explicit ESG commitments that have representations and warranties where the suppliers are legally committing to address major ESG risks. And so that includes addressing major ESG incidents and non-conformities that you identify through due diligence, as well as any corrective mitigation measures that you need them to take action on. Then compliance with all the relevant local and international ESG laws and regulations, prohibition of major ESG risks like forced labor, child labor, adherence to fair labor practices, and implementation of various ESG management systems and ISO standards. To look out for here is one is on the scope limit, often on regulations, is to applicable law. Whereas increasingly what we see as an expectation from financing is that they want the adherence to be to international standards. And even if, for example, you're not operating in Europe, EU battery regulation is seen as kind of the industry gold standard, and therefore an expectation that suppliers should be able to adhere to those standards even outside of Europe. Another very common one that I'm sure we're familiar with is vague language or clauses that are often so broad that they become unenforceable wording. So, things like best efforts as an example. And then no corrective action provisions in the contracts, which means that if you do identify risks, it might be hard to get the supplier to mitigate against those. And then lastly, other enforcement clauses to look for are making sure there's subcontractor oversight. So requiring these ESG standards and due diligence to be mirrored down the supply chain. So not just with the tier one supplier, but how do they mirror these back into the supply chain where the real risks sit? Making sure that you also have permissions around auditing rights, covering again the supplier, but also major subcontractors down into the supply chain. And then also data disclosure. So contracts that mandate additional ESG reporting, supply chain traceability data at this pre-contractual point, of course, but also throughout at key points of manufacture and delivery. And so here, what you're looking for is to make sure that you do have coverage across the supply chain and that you do have these flow down of requirements and that there's clear reporting mechanisms in place. And so this kind of gives you the landscape of what exactly it is that financing and regulation is now expecting. But I know we have a couple of minutes left, so I can see that there's been a lot of questions that have come in. So happy to jump in and answer some of these questions. So answer live. I can see from Alistair, this is a question for you, Andres. Currently, we haven't seen a DNP of 5 years, only 2 years. Is 5 years becoming more standard in the market? Do you keep a warranty bond open for the full 5 years?
Yes, thank you, Alistair. I think it's a good question. To say that it's becoming a market standard, probably it's not there yet, but it's going to be because we see now suppliers being more open to accept this, especially when you have larger projects. For the warranty bond, it will definitely depend how you have set up your LTSA and your warranty agreement. Normally in our projects, what we do is to split the two. So we have one agreement for the long-term service and another agreement for the warranty. And normally in some instances, we cover the warranty bond for the full period of the warranty agreement. And some others is just during the DMP, in other words, the 5 years. So answering your question, yes, we can keep it open for the 5 years. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. And so I can see another question that's come in around we work with one of the largest best suppliers. Can we expect them to manage supply chain ESG risks for us? I think this is one of the most common questions we get from developers. So glad someone has asked this, which is, I'm working with a tier one supplier. Surely they're large enough they can manage this risk. I think one of the key criteria that we often see coming increasingly from financing is a desire for independent verification on ESG due diligence. And the reasoning for that is similar when you're looking at technical commercial risk. Obviously, there is an incentive misalignment between the supplier that wants to do what they can to win the contract and minimize any, risks coming up, and you as the developer and then your financing that wants to make sure that you've identified any risks and are mitigating those ahead of time. And so generally the expectation is that you need to have this, therefore, independent due diligence to identify and be accurately mitigating those risks. Um, Another question that's come in is for you, Andres. How can calendar degradation be managed during construction, and what strategies can be implemented to manage it effectively?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one. Definitely that would be first of all based on what specifications you have on your employer's requirement. Normally we request that the supplier has to provide two curve and they have to be guaranteed. One is for a calendar agent and the other one is for cycling agent. So the calendar agent is going to be the degradation from FATs to the assume taking over of the plant. And this becomes a bit of a very gray area and contentious point for negotiation with the supplier. But that has to be agreed pre-signing contracts as how the curve is going to look like to give you the allowance of time for energization. But more importantly, there, you need to have what your daily losses are so you can calculate what is the impact on the state of health of the battery in case that you have delays, which normally happens with the on the grid side. In average, you can expect 9 months delay in the projects. So how you manage this is tough negotiations with the suppliers. Normally, you can get 5 months of grace period from FAT to when the batteries needs to be energized. But then your technical specification has to request that the supplier is responsible for charging the battery if you need to top up the state of charge. And this charging the battery sometimes is forgotten completely and becomes a bottleneck in the projects because it's going to delay commissioning. Again, all goes back to the technical specification, and all of these elements has to be drafted in there. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres. I know we are out of time, but there's still more questions, so we can follow up afterwards on email with anyone else that's asked questions. Appreciate everyone's probably got busy days, so we'll want to wrap things up there. Thank you so much, Andres, for joining us, and thanks everyone for joining as well.
Thank you for the opportunity.